Hello, welcome to Minds Behind the Terror podcast. I'm Dave Kajganich. I am the creator and one of the showrunners of the AMC show The Terror, and I'm here in the studio with executive producer and co-showrunner Hugh.
Hello.
And we welcome today the author of the sublime novel The Terror, on which our show is based, author Dan Simmons, calling in from Colorado. Welcome, Dan. Hi.
Hi, Dave. Thank you.
So let's start with the very beginning. This was a mystery from actual naval history that you decided to transform into a novel that was crossed with Gothic horror. Can you tell us a little bit about where you got the idea for this, how you went about preparing to write it, anything that can give us insight into how you blended all of these remarkable genres into this incredible book?
I'd known since I was a kid that I wanted to tell a story about either the North or South Pole. And the reason is that when 1957, 58, when I was very young, actually I was just a fetus, they had the International Geophysical Year. And that really caught my imagination. The International Geophysical Year saw cooperation between American and Soviet scientists. It's the height of the Cold War. And it's the first time they set a permanent base at the South Pole. And I fell in love with Arctic stories. I had one book left on a book contract with a publisher I really liked, and we hadn't decided what that book was. And I wanted to write a scary story about the Arctic, in this case, the Northern Arctic. And that happened because I was doing a lot of research in Antarctica and just couldn't figure out what the macabre, Gothic, scary part would be. I wanted to put it in, but I didn't think they'd go for, an 8-foot-tall vampire penguin.
You might be surprised.
There was a footnote on a book I was reading about the Franklin expedition, which I'd never heard of. And I decided that's what I was going to write about. And it had a tremendous amount of the unknown that I could fill in. That's what novelists love. And so I told my editors excitedly that this is what I was going to do. I was going to call it The Terror after the HMS Terror. They went with the Airbus and got stuck in the ice, and all the crew disappeared in history. And they said no. And it's the first time a publisher said that. I said, why not? I think it's going to be a pretty good novel. And they said, look, nobody's interested, and a bunch of people have been dead for 150 years.
That sounds like some of our meetings.
So I did what maybe you do in such a meeting. I just thanked them, and I liked them all. I had a good editor, said goodbye, and bought back my last book on the contract and went out and wrote it on spec.
Well, why don't we take a step back, Dave, and will you tell us about how you found Dan's book and that experience?
Sure. Well, Dan, you might remember some of these steps from your side of it, which is that originally this was optioned by Universal as a feature. And I sort of tried to get the rights and was a bit too late, and tracked them down to the producers at Universal who were running the project, and got myself hired as the screenwriter for a feature adaptation. By the time I was ready to start actually committing an outline to paper, Universal had let the rights go because there was a competing project. It was interesting to sort of rack up reasons why people wanted to make it but didn't feel that they could pull the trigger. And we were so grateful when AMC finally called us back and said, look, we figured out a model where we can do this as a limited series. It really felt like 10 episodes was a great length for this. And because we could blend genres in a way that, we could unpack sort of slowly, more slowly than a lot of shows would have done, and drive the plot as much as we could, like the novel, with character choices and decisions, as opposed to just horror kind of entering the frame and taking over for one set piece after another. So it was a long journey getting this to AMC, but at the end of the day, I think we found the right home for it.
I can no longer imagine a 2-hour version, feature film version of this story, and I can't imagine a second season with this story. I think it was just right.
It does feel like we did a 10-hour cinematic novel.
Only 4 of us at this table are Arctic veterans. There'll be no melodramas here. Just live men or dead men.
Dan, Dave and I talk about how addictive the research gets for this when you start going down the rabbit hole. How did you approach the research?
I think most novelists run into that, but since I write a lot of quasi-historical novels, at least set in history, I get totally addicted to going down the rabbit hole. Readers say, well, Simmons' book is too long and the descriptions of things are too exhausting. But I watch your characters go on deck, and there are all the things and views and everything that I tried so hard to describe, and then people call me, talky, verbose. And in print, I have to do it that way. But you just pan the camera a little bit.
Yeah, you have words, we have images. It's for every 1,000 of yours, we get one.
Yeah.
But I remember this passage in your book where it talks about all the different ices, and you vest it with so much psychological import. we talk about that passage a lot in the writer's room. It was one of our highlights of this is how you do great descriptive writing.
And you made so many parallels between things like the environments or the ships and characters. You built a kind of code book for the show without realizing you were doing it, which is making visual metaphors out of a lot of these things that would normally just be exposition or historical detail. Well,
especially between Crozier and the ship. I mean, when you hear about Crozier's relationship with Terror, and you have so many amazing passages about, the groan of the ship and how it, then you cut to a scene with Crozier and how you feel that the bones of Crozier is embedded in the ship. And we really took a lot from that.
Well, I noticed that on one of the episodes where Lord Franklin is trying to get back in touch with Crozier, trying to be friends with him again. I think it's a brilliant episode you guys wrote.
You've succeeded in avoiding Erebus most of the winter.
I'm a captain. I'm peevish of my own ship. I leave it and hear disaster knocking at its doors before I'm 10 steps away.
And that was beautifully written. You got so much of Crozier right there.
It was a pleasure to write these characters on the backs of your writing of these characters, because you really, it's not the easiest thing in the world to do, as you know, from having written, a whole long string of historical books, is to make these people's psychologies feel as modern as they must have felt in their day, while still being able to articulate some of the blind spots of being from the eras they were from. I'm curious, from a sort of a history nerd point of view, if people watch the series and like the series and read the book and like the book and want to know more about this expedition, what's the first book about the Franklin expedition you would point people to? What was most helpful or most interesting in your research?
I apologize. I can't think of the name of it, but it's a collection of stories about both South and North Pole. And so it's a short section on the Franklin expedition, but it didn't make mistakes. And most of the other books that I read keyed, and videos for that matter, like PBS did a story about the Franklin expedition, but they keyed off a 1987 attempt by several doctors to figure out what happened to the crew. And they exhumed 3 crewmen's bodies from the first island where they stayed the first winter. And those crewmen had only been on the ship a couple of months, but they decided, because of a high lead content, that the lead had poisoned them and then made them stupid and made them paranoid and everything. But they didn't compare that test of lead with any, a background in people in London at the time. And later they did. So I didn't believe the lead thing.
Well, that's the fascinating thing about a mystery with this many parts and pieces kind of in flux, is you can create all kinds of competing narratives about it. And what's fascinating about writing a fictional version is you can't have that kind of ambiguity. You have to make a decision. I think people will enjoy very much ways that the show and the book have a similar point of view, and also ways that they diverge in their points of view, because there are so many ways to tell this story.
Well, and how much we invest responsibility in the audience as well, right?
Sure.
In terms of your book and our show as well, we're not against interpretation, that there's a responsibility in the audience part to put together. We're not going to hand feed them. There'll be some people who put more of an onus on Franklin, and others who would say, if I was in that position, I probably would have made the same decision. Oh no, this definitely killed them in. No, this killed them in. That dialogue is exciting. When you read fans talk about your show and your books in really smart, insightful ways.
Would it help if I said that I made a mistake?
You misunderstand me, Sir John. I only meant to describe why I brood, not that I judge.
I don't worry about who or what my reading audience is. People ask me about that. I don't imagine a certain reader, but I've always tried to write for somebody who's more intelligent than I am. My perfect reader would be just smart as hell, speak 8 languages, have fantastic world experiences. And I want to write something to please that person. And I think your show does the same thing.
Well, that was our motto. We wanted to be the sort of the dumbest members of our collaboration. And there's a sort of a horrifying moment when you realize that's come true. Tell us a little bit about why you made the decisions to tell the story in the order you told it, and whether you sort of felt like there was anything from the way you had told it that we were a missed opportunity. We'd love to know sort of what your experience of that was.
I don't think there were any missed opportunities in terms of not adapting my way of telling it. And I can't remember all the reasons for why I broke it down that way. Some of them were just very localized to, when I was writing that particular bit. But I do know that it gains a lot by being told chronologically the way you're doing it. So For me, that seems now the logical way to tell it again.
Have you ever read the novel in chronological order? When we hired writers for the writers, when we gave them a list of what the chapters were like in chronological order, and I think we asked half the room to read it in your order and half the room to read it in chronological order, so we could have a meaningful discussion about whether there were things about telling it without being in chronological order that we wanted to embrace or not. It was a fantastic experience, and I wonder if you've ever read the chapters in chronological order, because it's also a fantastic book.
I haven't read them that way. They were that way in my mind before I started getting fancy and breaking them up and moving them around in time and space. But I would love to have seen that experiment.
The reason we can get away with it in the show is because there is a loved book out there that people trust, and it is a classic in this genre. And so, I mean, this is a perfect example of the amount of gratitude we owe the book, because we got away with a lot of things that maybe you wouldn't have been able to get away with because you came before us.
When speaking of those rabid fans, Dan, so it's been really interesting reading audience reactions to the show from people who've loved the books and who just naturally will compare the two, and we've been heartened by just how supportive our fans are of the show. There is this controversy. Some people like our choice to give Lady Silence a voice, and some people feel it was sacrilege to your book. Where do you fall on that?
At first, I was surprised. In fact, when you were hunting for an actress for Lady Silence, and I read about that, and it said somebody who's fluent in this Inuit language and this Inuit language. And what the hell? Having seen her with a tongue and heard her, and knowing the different reason they call her Lady Silence, it all works for me. And I was also surprised when Captain Crozier could speak fairly fluent Inuit dialect, because I had him just not understanding a thing. I love it when readers get rabid about not changing something from a book. And I have to talk to them sometimes, not because I have a lot of things adapted. This is the first one, but I love movies. They say, well, aren't you worried it will hurt your book? And first I explained Richard Congdon's idea that you can't hurt a book anyway, except by not reading it. I mean, the books are fine no matter how bad some adaptation becomes. The books abide. And so I wasn't concerned with the changes that I see. I get sort of tickled, whereas some readers get upset. They just have that set. So I think the vast majority of viewers haven't, well, I know the vast majority haven't read the book, haven't heard of the book probably. They're going to keep watching because of the depth of the characters. And that's based on the first 2 episodes. And I agree with them completely.
She said that if we don't leave now, we're going to Hukahoi.
Disappear.
We get asked a lot of questions about the supernatural element of the show and the way a monster does or does not figure in the narrative. In seeing our episodes, did it feel surprising or did it feel faithful to the way you imagined it as well to your book?
It was surprising to me in how well it was done, because it's hard, I know, to show restraint in a series like this, certainly in a movie, but it's hard to show restraint in showing and explaining the monster. The way you did it in the first few episodes to me were just lovely. Just, a hint of a glance at something, and then you see the results of this creature. So that's what I tried to do in the novel. One of the reasons I moved around through space and time. Part of what I wanted to do was not cheapen the story and not cheapen the reality of these poor men dying by just throwing in a monster. And so I tried to do it in a way that would not disrespect the true tale. And I believe you're doing it the same way I tried.
The way that you incorporated the supernatural into the book, I mean, I was a fan of it when I first read it. It was jaw-dropping the way that it fits so well on a level of plot, on a level of character, and on a level of theme. And so when we, got the green light to adapt it, I was just, I was so confident that we were going to be able to do something with it that would be able to be nuanced because the bones of it are so organically terrific.
It helped us know what we didn't want to do. That formed so much of our conversation. If this is what we do not want, this is what we do not want. And slowly you whittle down to getting down to the essence of what this thing had to be.
Another character from the book that really stands out for fans that they are wondering what the world we're doing with is Manson. And I was curious what you made of the fact that he is pretty invisible in the first 3 episodes of the show, and that some of his plot beats have been given to a character called Gibson, who I don't think he's featured very much in the novel. And I wondered if that caught you off guard or if you sort of intuitively had a sense of what we were doing in making that change.
Any discussion of Manson, to me, leads to Hickey converting him to his future, his tribe, the tribe he wants to have, the group of worshipers that I think Hickey wants to have. But he does it by sex below decks. Hickey's not gay at all. He's a manipulator to me. And he was manipulating Manson, who was big and dumb in my book. He's manipulating by this sexual encounter. So, but I was curious whether you were worried about showing that.
Well, we weren't worried about showing characters having same-sex affairs or relationships. We wanted to make room in Hickey's character for actual affection, or if not affection, then companionship or some kind of connection.
Lieutenant Irving, I was hoping we'd meet.
Mind the grease here, sir.
I wanted to thank you for your help, for your discretion, I mean.
Call it anything but help, Mr. Hickey. Please. I exercise clemency for a man abused by a devious seducer.
We wanted to make sure that Hickey had access to command in some way, that a steward, an officer's steward, would be able to provide him that an able seaman wouldn't be able to provide him. And that was really valuable to us in terms of charting out all of these character stories, was how does Hickey know what he knows about how command is dissatisfied or where the fractures are if he can't see them from where he sleeps in his cot in the forecastle.
I mean, we know that there were relations between same-sex on ships. It just was part of this world, not to belie that there was serious consequences for it. But, we have 129 characters, and we wanted them to feel fully fledged and rich, and, passions do naturally develop. I think to ignore that and have no characters engaged in sexual relations would have felt just as odd or perhaps even more controversial. And when Irving discovers Gibson and Hickey, his shock is from such a subjective point of view of his moral center. It's not the camera's perspective, right? Our camera is very neutral in that scene. It's Irving, that character at that point in the show, that is infusing a sense of horror. That's his horror moment.
I'd like to add that it's not the gay connection that would cause criticism, but I was flayed alive because the most openly, quote, gay, unquote, character, that is Hickey, maybe hunting for affection, but definitely hunting for power. He's the only one, they said, in reviews, and he's a killer and a bad person. And so I'm homophobic. I was flayed alive for that. The word homophobic appeared in about 80 reviews. Nobody mentioned the purser.
Right,
who,
right. Bridgens and Pegler.
Yeah, and I think he's a fascinating character. I love getting glimpses of him in the series because he's super smart, he's super wise. He's probably wiser than any of the commanders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And he's obviously in love with, who is that he's in love with in the show?
Pegler.
Yes, that makes sense. And so Pegler says, is this another Herodotus? And no, I'm giving you Swift now. He's educating the man he cares for.
I understand you've cleared up our association for Lieutenant Irving.
You spoke to him? Directly? Christ, Cornelius, I'd reassured him.
Cornelius Hickey is a devious seducer. That was your reassurance. You've got some face. You know that?
We wouldn't have dramatized Hickey's story if we weren't also going to pull in Pegler and Bridgen's story, because we knew that people, are predisposed to sort of to make that kind of quick assumption, and we just wanted to make sure that the show didn't have that blind spot and reflected the book, which also doesn't have that blind spot.
We had those same questions with Lady Silence, and I'm sure you did as well. When we meet her, she's a frightened young woman who's about to lose her father, and that's a universal character moment that anyone can relate to, and the otherness is secondary. But then once in the end scene of 102, when she's sitting there grieving her father, and there you have that language barrier with everyone else. We worked with Nevi on this because we wanted to make sure the language itself was as accurate as possible. So when you say disappear, making sure that the disappear in our language means the same thing as disappear in her language. I think whenever you have characters that feel othered in most media and you're bringing them into your show, Dave and I also just wanted to make sure we weren't swaying on the pendulum on the other side of being almost too careful about touching them. And with Nevi, I think when you have an actor of that talent, she was strong. She was representing a voice that she felt very confident in, and that was very reassuring for us.
Well, it works well. And when her father's dying, she throws herself on his chest and says, I'm not ready. It's too soon. I'm not ready. And I love that in the show, because if she's going to become a shaman, he's dying. It's not reached that point of education yet where she feels secure. And later on, beyond what we're discussing today, she becomes, to me, in the show, I see her as more and more majestic.
I do love the word majestic because I think it describes pretty much all of our characters. I agree. I do think there is something very sublime about who they have become at the end, because when you go through that much trials and tribulations, it is this, it's this beautiful human spirit to endure.
I think that's one of the central themes of the story that you've brought out so clearly, is in most post-apocalypse, terrible situation movies and shows, everybody turns just nasty as hell. They start shooting each other. It's just like World War III when they should be helping each other survive. And I found, even though there was controversy, even though there was opposition in this story of people opposing against each other, still that they rose to the occasion. And that is so rare, I think, in much media these days, or even books, where the characters are themselves and they do the best they can. And when things get bad, they rise to the occasion.
The first conversation you and I had about the book, I was basically pitching you sort of what I thought thematically the book was about, and I talked a lot about that in a disaster like this, a kind of moral emergency, that we would get a chance to unpack what is sort of best and worst in these characters' souls.
I confuse readers often when I was on book tour for this book. And it was a long time ago. I've written a few million words since then, but I confuse people by saying that if you want a theme for the survival story of the terror, it's love. It's love between the men, and just unstinting love. And this came out in a piece of dialogue in the first 2 episodes.
I'll not have you speak of him uncharitably, James. He is my second. And if something were to happen to me, you would be his second. You should cherish that man.
Sometimes I think you love your men more than even God loves them, Sir John.
For all your sakes, let's hope you're wrong.
That, to me, was right the theme I was working with. And with Crozier, who shows it in a different way, with Fitzjames, who's struggling to show leadership, and between the men, despite their hierarchy and the British hierarchy, the rank and lieutenants and so forth, eventually they come down to loving the men they're trying to save. And I found that lovely.
Thank you so much for listening to The Minds Behind the Terror. Join us in our next edition when we talk about episodes 4 through 6 with the additional guest, Adam Nagaitis, phoning in from London. We will see you soon.
I'll confess something else to Adam. First time I watched it, I thought your character was a good guy because he jumped down in that grave to put the lid back on.
Welcome to the Minds Behind the Terror podcast. I'm Sue Hugh, executive producer and showrunner of this labor of love, here with my partner in crime, Dave Kajganich, executive producer and showrunner.
Hello.
Today we welcome the terror author Dan Simmons and actor Adam Nagaitis, who plays Cornelius Hickey on the TV series. Dan is calling in from Colorado, and Adam, you're here from London.
I am. Hi.
Adam and Dan, I don't know that you have been introduced to one another, so welcome both and happy to have you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lovely to be here.
I have to start with just a fanboy meltdown here. I don't do this. I don't praise actors that much, even when I've met them. But I need to use a word that as a novelist and as a mature American human being, I don't use because the younger generations have appropriated it. It's the only adjective they use in their whole vocabulary. But Adam, your performance as Cornelius Hickey was brilliant. It was awesome.
Thank you so much, Dan. And obviously, the feeling is beyond mutual. There is no Cornelius Hickey without you. So it's really overwhelming to hear someone like you say that. So thank you so much.
This is so touching.
And I'll confess something else to Adam. First time I watched it, I thought your character was a good guy because he jumped down in that grave to put the lid back on. And it was only second viewing. I thought, like, he stole the boy's ring. Bastard.
So this is the second podcast of this series. If you haven't heard the first one, episode 1, we recommend highly that you go back and listen to those. That first episode will cover episodes 101 through 103. Today we'll talk about episodes 104 to 106. And if you have not seen those episodes, please don't break our hearts and listen to this podcast. Watch the show first. We'll have many spoilers that we'll be discussing. So now, since you guys have finally met one another, Dan and Hickey, Dan and Adam, should we talk about, Dan, just how you first originally structured Hickey in the novel? And we know that you loved Hickey, but your experience watching the show in terms of seeing the changes that we have made and what we've kept from the book, how that affected you.
Mostly the changes that you guys and Adam did for the character of Hickey, I think, I don't want to praise too much, but they're marvelous. They showed me a succession of not villains, but complex, sometimes wicked character in a way that I don't think I got to in the book. My character was like a bit too much like Iago in Othello. You know, he tended to be motiveless malevolence, or malignancy, which is the way you describe Iago. And there aren't many Iagos in the world, but the way that Adam created Hickey out of the soft clay of my introduction was marvelous to me. I could just see all the wheels turning in Hickey's head and all the ways he's looking for an edge. So I took it to maybe point C or D. You guys took it through Y.
The last thing that we've seen Hickey do is that he has gone through the lower decks of terror and has shat on a bed and has found a resignation letter from Crozier that no one is meant to see because Crozier is now in command of the expedition. We have laid out a different kind of ascension, if you will, or architecture for Hickey's arc in the show from the book. And I wonder, Adam, if you could speak a little bit to having read, I think, part of the novel and been told to stop reading by me and Sue because we didn't want you to be confused. How did you receive these episodes, and how did you plan to sort of to cover the distance between those 2 points in Hickey's arc, which it's a lot of distance to cover? The
pieces of the novel that stayed with me and unfortunately I could not get out of my head as much as I would try because they were very potent aspects of Hickey were always useful. But it's, as you said, Dan, it was just the switch. I'm just backtracking because there'll be a reason, but the switch from the clarification to me, or the justification of his motivations was all really I had to find a new soul, a new motor, and that motor sort of begins, perhaps changes a gear in episode 4 when Hickey is, I don't want to say betrayed, but you know, he's for the first time he's proactive about a decision he makes when he goes and grabs Lady Silence.
There'll be no violence towards this woman without charges brought and well proved. Who is responsible for this?
I am, sir. He's pushing the boundaries of what his courage is allowing him to do at that point, and he knows that this is dangerous, but it's also completely necessary, and he can't help himself. I think he's fairly sure of a reward, but what ends up happening, he considers himself constantly self-aware, like an incredibly high introspective IQ, that if he's achieved anything in his life, it is that he is completely honest with himself at all times. He has these conversations in the mirror all day, every day, just to make sure that he's sharp, that nobody will call him out on any sort of fracture that they can see within him. He sees his weaknesses. He accepts as a soulful narcissist, I suppose, is a way of describing him. But one thing that has escaped him, he realizes, is that his desperate need to be accepted, to be loved, to be seen and be patted, and to be to have that authority figure, whatever you want to call it, allowing you the rite of passage.
Captain Crozier, there's something I want to say, but I hardly dare speak the words.
Oh, speak the words, Mr. Hickey.
Of all I know in this world, and of this world, I tell you, I do not believe it is an animal we battle.
And he realizes when he gets lashed, this day of sort of revelation, where he understands every time he gets hit. You know, I took a lot of the lashing I took through the way that Hickey is described in the book, that his life has been this low-level horror story, and pain is something that is incredibly interesting to him. You know, it's not something to be avoided, it's something to be embraced.
Adam, if we had to break down the whipping scene, because, I mean, your performance in that moment, I mean, it's so extraordinary, the amount of what you were able to pull out physically as well as just emotionally in your face in that scene. Will you walk us through what did you internally, because in all you were saying about Hickey being with one foot planted in pragmatism, but also at the same time being the self-aware philosopher, but in that moment of the flashing, some different higher kind of understanding must have put in place because pain is at work there. Was your process different in that scene?
You must forgive me as well for going on, because when I talk about Hickey, I get lost and I go forever. But I remember it sort of breaking it down, preparing it was breaking it down into how you are perceived when you enter that realm of torture or judgment or whatever it is, and he always going to make sure that he didn't lose the experience in stupid human things like shame or, you know, consideration of embarrassment. Or he never walks in, you know, it's almost as if there's never anybody else in a room. He doesn't care to cloud it. And that was the very first point, was to get in and go, what does it mean to be punished as a boy? I was thinking, that's it. What does that mean? I wonder what they're going to do to me. And when he realizes that, and that these people around him, that, I don't know, it's kind of, I suppose it was such a strange collaboration of sensations, because at the one point, you know, I'm in this, as an actor, I'm naked in this scene with all these people, and being punished as a boy should have taken Hickey down. You know, this shame should have overwhelmed him, and it should have been this sort of embarrassing situation, and instead it became empowering. He wasn't afraid of crying and screaming, and again, it's not, if it's practical and it helps, it's no big deal. It's just pain, and everybody else would be in pain, and it doesn't matter. Even if, you know, if people perceive him as weak, he'll find a way to get him. It doesn't matter.
Again.
And something we haven't talked about much yet in these podcasts is this theme of hubris and the hierarchy and the patriarchy. And Dan, you explore it fully in your book in terms of figuring out, you know, where our characters come from and their foundations and backbones. They come from a very distinct historical period that really thought that their empire was the crowning achievement of human civilization, right? And that the Royal Navy is this prime embodiment of that conquest. They were going to go out into the world, find that sea route to China, and the world will be theirs. In both the book and our show, that kind of thinking is what drives them into the heart of peril, right? And what was always interesting about the Hickey character in some ways was he questioned, in some ways he's very too modern for his times in some way, in that he questioned that hierarchy, that patriarchy. And that's something that I think Dave and I can both sympathize with as well. The character was so interesting to write for was because Hickey was in some ways an easy embodiment of our voice today. And then when we watched your performance, what was great about your performance, it was never slippery, because it's really easy to play Hickey as slippery. I always felt that your performance was always located in something very, very direct. People can play characters like Hickey where they never want to commit to anything because he's supposed to be nebulous or too ambiguous. That was never the situation. When you have that smile on your face, when Irving is saying, climax exercises, we know, you're not playing Irving, which is great. And I think that's such a success of your portrayal of Hickey is it never feels slippery.
Well, an awful lot of people came in to audition for this part, and what we found was a lot of people, most people, in fact, everyone but you, Adam, played Hickey as a kind of pre-built villain. And when we saw your first tape come in and you were open-handed and you were smiling your way through the same monologue that everyone else had put fangs on, we knew that you were our Hickey. Because that kind of charisma and that kind of confidence and that kind of hubris, in a way, is what were going to be the magic ingredients, I think. It's what we sort of loved about the opportunity for the show to take the Hickey from Dan's book and sort of turn it in a different, unexpected way so that readers who hadn't read the book wouldn't know right off the bat whether they were meant to sympathize with Hickey or be wary of him or both. And I think that's a great achievement of the performance, is you sort of feel you're on both rails the whole time, and I think that's kind of an amazing achievement.
That's how you wrote it. I mean, that was exactly, I think you saw what you wrote. The real strength of that character was in his understanding of himself and his understanding of the hierarchy and how this world functions. He's studied it. Gave him an intelligence. I think that's the way I saw it when I read it.
But it's pretty amazing to think that by this point in the show, you have stolen a dead boy's ring. You have shit on your ex-boyfriend's bed. You have murdered our favorite doctor. I mean, there's a lot. You've done a lot of things to turn an audience against you, but I don't think that's how an audience will feel.
All completely justified.
You're acquitted. Can I steer the conversation just slightly in a different direction? Because, Dan, you made our lives very difficult in one way. So... You have these two incredible set pieces in your book.
Yes.
And they happen to fall chronologically so close to each other that production-wise, we had to film them one episode apart. So in 105, we have the huge blanky mass Tuunbaq fight sequence. And then in 106, we have Carnival. They are, along with something that comes at the end of our show, those two sequences are, some of our biggest just action set pieces. There's extraordinary spectacles. But Dave and I, we grew many gray hairs in this process because they're so fantastic in the book. They're fan favorites in the book. We knew that we were going to be pillaged based on whether or not we succeeded in those scenes. So seeing the mass sequence and seeing Carnival, what did you think?
I know the difficulty in putting two set pieces like that close to each other. I mean, Chase with Blanky, it was pretty dynamic, and even more so from the book to your show. It's very dynamic. I love the character of Blanky all the way through to his ending. He's wonderful.
Speaking of the mass sequence, what we were discussing prior, this is the first time we actually get to see the Tuunbaq. We're curious how both of you, because Dave and I, we've been very careful about how we utilize and deploy the Tuunbaq in our show, but making sure also that narratively and story-wise it didn't feel like, oh, we need to ramp up this episode, we'll throw the Tuunbaq in. That we were very more deliberative of when we put the Tuunbaq in our show and making sure that it didn't, like Dave was saying, didn't feel like the monster of the week. But I mean, Adam, you have a very particular relationship with the Tuunbaq that starts to become revealed in episode 4. Could you just walk through how you were thinking about it?
The way that I started to think about the Tuunbaq was as a character. That was the best way for me to think about it, as another member of the narrative in general. And it's a person. It of all the people, there are only, including the Tuunbaq, there are two that I respect. Crozier, who I see as something that maybe a soulmate would be a way of describing it, and the Tuunbaq, who I see as a person who is, he or she is true to themselves and unafraid and undeterred and pure in their resolve, and their execution, and so it's almost admiration and mutual respect, and that when that Tuunbaq looks at me and I look back, that I see myself and I see what I might become, or You know, and I have, and Hickey sees himself as having elements that the Tuunbaq doesn't have. You know, the idea of Hickey so rarely sees people that he acknowledges that in his mind deserve or warrant his acknowledgement. And when he first meets eyes with the Tuunbaq, that's what he goes through.
Dan, I was always curious to ask you about the Tuunbaq in terms of your creation of that creature. I mean, in our research, we found elements of different sort of spirits from Inuit mythology that seem like that the Tuunbaq is a kind of an amalgam of. Can you walk us through sort of how you hit on that idea and what parts of it are from Inuit mythology that you can remember, and what parts of it are your own invention, or just how that creature came to be? It's such an interesting, fascinating creation.
That's a good question, and I'll answer. But first I wanted to add an unharmonious, non-praising comment, which is when I was watching the series on my little computer screen and got to the Tuunbaq chasing Blakey up in the rigging and so forth, I paused the show, walked out in my front yard, aimed west, and shouted, "Don't show the fucking Tuunbaq!" Not yet. I'm sure you heard that.
Did you think we showed it too much in that sequence?
I did when I saw the sequence. When I've seen the show front to back 1.5 times now, I think it's fine. Dave, you remember when we first talked about things, I was stressing that left, right, and center, which is I was based it on a favorite movie of mine, which nobody else has as a favorite movie, but it's 1951 version of The Thing. Howard Hawks directed it, even though he gave the credit to his DP, but he directed it. And it got so every time a door opened, every person turned and looked. And the monster turned out to be James Arness in a silly suit. But the tension was tremendous. And I think you guys built it up very nicely. You know, everybody's ready looking over his shoulder. There's that scene where somebody does, a young man does, and wiser man says, "It's only the ice, Georgie, it's only the ice." But of course it's not.
He's been going on like that since the wind died. Take your wigs off. Don't you hear that?
It's a fine line to walk, because on the one hand, you know, I don't know if anyone would have made the show if it didn't have a, you know, quote unquote, a monster in it. And so we were trying to be very intelligent about how we deployed the Tuunbaq in the show, and wanted to make sure that when we did, it didn't feel like it was meant to spice something up, that it felt sort of earned in some way. And we were confident that the less we showed of the Tuunbaq, the better. But that isn't, it's not the easiest sell if you don't happen to agree with this point of view. And, you know, luckily we were able to sort of have our cake and eat it too, in a way. But still, even when episodes, 1, 2, and 3 aired, you know, we were reading reviews and people's comments online saying, is there a creature in the show or isn't there? I mean, people really want that. Some people really want that settled. And so we tried to do it both ways. We tried to show just enough to make sure that it felt like we weren't being coy about it, but not so much that we exhausted what's interesting about it.
And also the fear, there is a danger if you put it off, because Dave and I agree with you that you want to hold off the reveal of the monster as long as possible, because it's just going to be more satisfying that way. But there's a tipping point to that as well. There's, right? Because if you delay it too long, then the expectations are almost too great. And when you delay the monster for so long, the level of perfection that the audience is going to expect is never, we were never going to please them. So at some point, by, finding that right balance point of we show them enough, they know that we're not playing coy with them.
We also had a storytelling reason, a really good one, to make sure we did show it up front in the first third of the season, which is, by the time you reach episode 6, you realize there's something wrong with the Tuunbaq, that it is getting sick or it is going off somehow. I mean, when Lady Silence finally decides that she's going to offer her tongue to it in hopes that it will accept her as a shaman and she can contain this disaster, this sort of mythological disaster that's happening, and it rejects her, and it's, it shows up to that scene looking a little woozy, and, there's obviously a cause to be concerned about it. that wouldn't have landed if we hadn't seen, in some form, the Tuunbaq in all of its majestic glory. We think of the Tuunbaq as quite presidential in terms of its comportment, that it is a pure expression of this mythology. It is the keeper of equilibrium. It is neither a hero nor a villain. But by the time we get to episode 6, we should be feeling a little bit panicked about what this creature is becoming. It seems to be falling apart in front of us in the same way that the men are.
Our Tuunbaq exists. We don't play that game of it's a figment of our character's imagination. That is one route we could have gone. We did not want to do that.
Adam, I don't know if you remember, when we finally got the scale model head of the Tuunbaq to Hungary, and we had it in a conference room, I think, and I grabbed you from set, and I didn't tell you where we were going, and I took you to a door, and I pushed you through it and closed it behind you, and in that room was the Tuunbaq, and you were the first person in the cast to see it. Do you remember what that experience was like?
That was terrifying. I do remember. I remember that day very, very well. It was just a head on a stick, wasn't it? And it was
a big head, but yeah, it was just
a big head on a stick. And I knew the importance of it. So I sort of closed my eyes and opened them. I remember thinking it was the eyes. It was the human eyes that convinced me that it was a unique thinking machine. It was a unique creature that was worthy of respect. That was kind of the thing that I remember thinking about it. And of course it was terrifying. But yeah, I remember the teeth, the human teeth. It was so brilliant. It was so brilliantly conceived. I remember it was head height, and I just stood in front of it for a while.
I remember it was 20 minutes before I opened the door.
For a long time. I was like, is it gonna move? It was great. It was really scary.
So Dan, walk us through where it came from. I mean, this is a creation almost from scratch, I think, from you.
Well, first I built the Tuunbaq out of what I think is a good monster and would be a good monster in the Arctic. And after constructing it, I went just tearing through Inuit mythology and stories and oral tales for quite a while before I found the right creature. He was called Tuunbaq in the mythology. But it could have been Sedna. Sedna is a great sea monster. They have so many wonderful beings. But you guys summed it up in dialogue.
From the shamans.
The
thing that eats in 2 legs and 4. The thing made of muscles and spells.
I don't understand. Is he describing a man?
Sorry, Sir James. I don't know what the hell he's describing.
That was the best summary of the Tuunbaq I've heard. I'm going to steal it from you if I ever, do readings on this book again.
Oh, good.
There it is. We've not heard that sound in far too long.
Especially enjoyed Carnival. I like it that you didn't follow my lead and turn the Carnival on the ice into the scene from The Mask of the Red Death. I had a sailor who actually read that story in Boston in my novel, so he's the one who set up the Carnival with all the rooms from the Edgar Allan Poe story. And yours, the idea of celebrating going home essentially when the sun rose, that made a lot more sense to me.
Well, do you know the reason we went in that direction? I think in the writer's room when we were discovering all the different sort of signs and symptoms of things like scurvy, nostalgia was considered a primary symptom of scurvy. It's how one way you could diagnose it. And when we thought about, well, if these men were going to throw a party and all bets were off in terms of what the theme of that party would be, we wanted to embrace, the likelihood that a lot of those men who are in early stages of scurvy at that point might have leaned too heavily on nostalgia, and that gave us a kind of a surprising new, sort of code to sort of explore in Carnival.
Come on, boys!
Now,
let's get our hair good and powder before that damn sun finds us again.
The idea that Dr. Stanley, who has a child back in England and has a clear sense of what the kind of illness that's on the table being discussed could do to the men, and he hears the news at the beginning of episode 6 that they're probably running out of food. And, that episode 6 is called A Mercy for a reason, that really Stanley thinks he's doing a great favor to all of the men by killing them. And it just was, I'm curious, when you watched that reveal in particular, that the Carnival was, the disaster was not going to come from the Tuunbaq, but was going to come from somebody who was a kind of Cassandra in a way, like understood what was coming in a way that a lot of the men didn't understand, whether that rang true emotionally to you in terms of how you would position these characters at that point in the novel.
In the novel, you don't have to compress time like that. The things could almost coexist and still work. So I had a little more freedom to do the Carnival. But when you showed the malignant motives of various people behind it, the doctor and so forth, the burgeoning insanity made sense.
Hold him! Hold him! Watch
out! Hickey's arc between episodes 4 and episode 6 is you sense someone who's come into a power but doesn't exactly know yet how he wants to use it, and is scanning other people and other relationships to try to find out where will the advantage will come from. And I think what's great about the final shot we have of Hickey in 6 is that is Hickey just before someone tells him, probably, that they're going to be walking out.
By the time we reach episode 6, he's well on the way to formulating in the material world, in our physical world, to formulating his sort of group. What's going on inside him, what's going on in his maybe even subconsciously or very, very, very quietly consciously, is a furthering of his understanding that this universe is for him. These happenings are for him. They have his name all over them, his real. And since the beginning of his life, he's been checking the dials, trying to tune into the right radio station where there's a clear voice of the numinous or the supernatural, or the universe, or God, or whatever you want to call it. He's hoping for the clear voice that says his name.
I have a question for Dave and Sue, which you looked at the muster of the crew as I did. I had to decide who was what in a fictional term. You have about 127 interesting stories if you want to pursue them. But were you aware early on that there was going to be one Messiah developing in the story?
I don't know if we looked at it in terms of a Messiah figure.
But Hickey does.
In these episodes, I think he doesn't quite yet know what he's going to become, except he knows he doesn't have to be subservient anymore to other people's versions of what he could become. I think he's not quite sure where he is. He knows he's just moved from one ladder to another ladder. He's no longer on the hierarchical ladder of the ships. He's on a bigger ladder, and he's climbing, and he doesn't quite yet know what heights that will reach. But it's fascinating to see Hickey unleashed in these episodes, but not yet know what he's going to put his power toward.
"104 through 106 takes place from the last sunrise of the year, and then end of 106 is the sunrise of the year. So it's, in terms of just that lovely visual metaphor, it's also our dark nights, where we have polar nights. I mean, did you guys, watching the episodes, did you guys feel that darkness? Dave and I were so curious whether or not people understood what it feels like to live in perpetual darkness for months, and whether or not our audience was going to get that. How did that come through for you?
The darkness, it was a hard thing, I think, to do in a series like this. It's pressure. It's like the men in the ship not only have the pressure of the ice groaning and moaning and growling and pushing at their ship, they have the pressure of the months of darkness. And I think you did it well. I don't know if it was a reviewer or a friend who said the show is all about, in the ship, it's all claustrophobia. Outside the ship, it's all agoraphobia, fear of open spaces.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
We talked a lot about that in the writer's room, about how there was, we didn't know which was worse, and characters would have different opinions about that. Is it better to be sort of sealed up in almost a coffin-like environment, or is it better to be exposed with no way to protect yourself? I don't know what I would choose.
And so that is episodes 104 to 106. Dave and I are here with Dan and Adam. It's been such a pleasure, you guys. Thank you for joining us. And next time, we'll be covering episodes 107 and 108. Dan and Adam, both of you will be back as well.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Great.
In complete honesty, it never occurred to me that any of those things were cruel or despicable.
Welcome to the Minds Behind the Terror podcast. I'm Sue Hugh, executive producer and showrunner of The Terror, and I'm here with my partner, Dave Kajganich, who also created the show.
Hello.
Dave and I are here in the studios in New York. It's snowing in April, but Dan Simmons is here from Colorado.
Hi.
And Adam Nagaitis, who plays Hickey, is here from London. And this is our third podcast. Today we'll be talking about episodes 107 and 108. So please, if you have not seen those episodes, push stop, go back, watch the episodes. We'll be spoiling tons of stuff here, so we'd love for you to hear with those episodes in mind. So just starting off with our discussion, this is 107, and this is where we say goodbye to our two ships, where we have our men abandoning ship. Dave and I, it really was an emotional moment filming those scenes. Even though we had a set that doubled for both ships, that was built life-size pretty much to replicate the actual ships. It's amazing how much of those sets have become home for us in Budapest. We left to then shoot the overland scenes in Croatia on this tiny island, Pag Island. And in the end, it became this welcome change of scenery for us. We and the crew and cast needed it. But to leave that stage in Budapest at Stern Studios, and I mean, Dave, you felt the same as well?
Particularly because at that point, I think we knew what the fate of the set was, which is that a water park in Hungary bought it to put on a hill next to a water slide. So we knew we were saying goodbye to not just our home, but a respectful depiction of the HMS Terror.
But I do love that it still has a life.
Too. Wet Hungarian kids for years to come will marvel at that set.
Adam, right before we abandoned ship, we have this pivotal scene with you speaking with Tozer and Gibson and several key crew members about beginning rumbles of mutiny, where you talk about an alternate form of leadership. And it's a very quiet scene, but it has a huge footprint narratively in our show. Do you remember shooting that?
That was probably one of his most, he's at his most confident, and he knows this is going to come up. He knows it, and he just allows it to happen. And then when he starts to smell that it's coming, he just slowly encourages it. And he lets very sort of, I hate using the term Machiavellian, but it is, he allows it to form itself.
Say what's on your mind. Are you among friends?
Am I? We could make a go of it for ourselves, can't we? Smaller group. Because 40 men are going to be too slow on that ice. Let me tell you.
Well, the ice will be slow going regardless. But once we make land,
then it'd be better to wait until the larger group hauls all the supplies to solid ground.
It's more like the Hickey unites the minds as opposed to sort of, leads them at that point. He's just clarifying what it is that they're all wanting to say. He's drawing it out of them.
He's creating a space where people have permission and safety to speak candidly about what they want.
And then also in that scene, what we do is we're watching all the men load the boats, the hauling boats. And, when Dave and I were doing research, and it's also in your book as well, Dan, just finding out how much these men took with them on that overland trip. And at first it just seems like insanity. Why would you take china plates? Why would you take
600 books?
They also took their the patent stoves. They took 900 pounds of chocolate that they ended up not eating.
Curtain rods was one that stuck out.
Metals, right. Yeah. I mean, Dan, when you were doing your research and you found, what was your interpretation of that?
Well, one interpretation is they weren't completely in control of their faculties at this point, 3 years into their nightmare. The loading was so haphazard and so bizarre. And we know that because we found all this, the searchers for Franklin found all this stuff in a boat along with the skeletons of the men. And why they would put that in that huge lifeboat and then haul that sledge to them halfway around the world, I have no idea, except that they were demented.
Why didn't they eat the chocolate?
I know! We ask ourselves that.
Some of what these men have packed is impractical at best, Francis. If we're to make it inland before winter, this cannot hold.
It's a long march, James. there'll be time to reconsider. Things will drop away. But to ask these men to see these bits of who they are as one more threat to them? No. Let them get some minds behind them before we ask them to do that.
What's interesting about fictionalizing something like this is that ultimately, as we were talking in an earlier podcast, you have to make a decision. I mean, we had to in some way explain that in the show, in the same way that you had to offer some kind of insight or explanation in the book. And our choice was to try to imagine that it was indicative of hope for the men, and that to ask them to put those things aside, even though it was going to be a lot harder to drag them along with them. Crozier's point of view is they'll know when the moment's right to drop them, and to ask them to do that sooner than they're naturally wanting to do it is to remove hope from the equation for them. And we hoped that, as an emotional truth, even if it doesn't make total practical sense, might explain part of it. And, that could dovetail very nicely with the fact that their own perception of reality or their faculties are starting to slip. But, one thing about these sort of fictional depictions of history, they have to feel emotionally real. And sometimes that's not so easy.
We talk about hubris, and we talk about how the British were so foolish. The English didn't ask the Inuit for help. They made foolish decisions, not the least of which are how overloading all these sledges are going to haul across 150 miles of ice and rock. But every culture has hubris. I'm sure I'm the oldest person in this discussion. I'll be celebrating my 70th birthday in a few days. One thing I know for sure is that every culture is hubristic. They're just loaded down with hubris, especially our current culture in America here. And we don't see it any more than the people then saw it. But my comment is simply, when they loaded those sledges, just like when they loaded the ship, they were taking England with them. Mm-hmm. Everywhere they went was England. And on the ship, they would have tea at a certain time. They would follow rituals that make no sense at all to an outsider. So my feeling was they were taking as much of England as they could load on those sledges.
It's interesting, Dan, one of the things we talked about in the writer's room was why they chose the route overland to King William Island, right? They could have gone to Fury Beach, where we know John Ross had left a cache of supplies. It's a shorter route, but instead they decided to track over the ice through King William Island, down to all the way around to get to the Hudson Bay Company outpost, 800 miles. Did you ever question why they chose that route?
I always questioned it. I didn't understand it because Crozier was so smart about other things. The only thing I know is that it's a much rougher route going to Fury Beach. But if anyone made it, it's not only stocked with supplies on that beach. It would be hard to get there, but you're home free essentially because a lot of ships go by there, even in a bad winter. I think he made a fatal mistake.
Do you think it's possible they were still imagining they were going to discover the passage? Because going south meant that if they did, for instance, leave skeleton crews on the ships to pilot them, if there was a thaw, they would all be heading generally in the same direction. I mean, that's kind of. I mean, we didn't grant Crozier at that point in our narrative that level of hubris, but it certainly he was imagining that it might be of real practical use for everyone to be heading south either on foot or by ship.
Yeah, Francis Crozier had spent his entire career carrying out impossible missions, I think, many of his explorations in Discovery Service, including Antarctica. But yeah, I think he was still thinking it was possible to map the passage, and possible that if the ships got out of the ice, the men he left behind could sail there. Maybe he could be helpful to them. It's hard to get in anybody's thinking, especially under such impossible circumstances. But following orders makes sense.
Once they reach King William Island, and you have that shot where Crozier and Fitzjames are climbing up the ice rack. I love just the look on Tobias and Jared's face, and we hold that beat for longer, and then we finally reveal that they did make it, that Camp Terror has been safely established.
Even the flag's up. We need to avoid, Francis.
But Dan, from where you were watching, how did King William Island look to you? I mean, because it's a huge set change for us, environmental change.
I thought it was the ninth circle of hell. I mean, there's no features at all. I know the actual island didn't have any small hills and so forth, as we have in the series, but who cares? It was beautiful.
We tried, Dan. We did. We really did.
I mean, what's crazy and puzzling about Pog Island is that apparently it's quite a summer destination for young DJs and things. We can't quite figure out why they go there, but It has a strange kind of severe beauty to it, doesn't it?
I agree with Dave. It has a strange. There was a strange lure, that island. I don't know why it's a summer destination, a summer party town. I remember as we were leaving, I started to see these random umbrellas get popped up on little beach areas. It was very freeing. There's one version of these people when they're on that boat and they're inhibited and they are claustrophobic and confined, and then as soon as you're out, it was just unleashing for me as Hickey. It was just so much more dangerous for everybody else from Hickey's point of view, that now he can go places, he can hide and do things. And I was thinking, just thank God for the rolling hills, because if it wasn't for those, certain things wouldn't have happened.
Well, I have a question for Dan, which is, when 107 begins, we take the audience to an unexpected scene, which is a flashback to various people coming on board to sign up for the expedition. And there is a man we've never met who comes to the table with Lieutenant Hodgson, and he introduces himself as Cornelius Hickey.
Any tips, sir, for a first-timer?
The advice I'm about to give you holds whether it's your virgin voyage or your 20th.
Then I'm keen to hear it, sir.
When the ship sets sail, be sure you're aboard. Here you are.
Sir.
2 in a month times first master, Mr. Hickey.
We realized in the writer's room pretty early that it only made Hickey's character more interesting if at some point in the narrative we revealed that he was a kind of imposter, that the actual Cornelius Hickey who lived and served on that ship and made sacrifices and died heroically on that ship, whom we've turned into, certainly in the novel, is turned into a villain, and we, eventually reach that point in our show, that we actually had a solution to that, which is that we could create a scenario where suddenly the narrative was charged with new possibilities and ambiguity by introducing the idea that Hickey, the man claiming to be Cornelius Hickey, is really not Hickey at all. So my question, I guess a question for you, Adam, is you didn't have all the scripts to begin with. So when you got the script for 7, what was your reaction to that as a turn of events in your character's arc?
I did know that Hickey wasn't Hickey before I got that script. I was going through my emails earlier on today before we came on to remind myself of sort of certain elements of it, and the number there's 104 emails between the three of us. 104.
Sounds right.
They're not just one email. We're talking chains of like 19 emails, and it's just me garbling on, and then you two highlight in red my question, and then you have these very concise and intelligent responses. Most of it was about how to, his who this person. Can I say his name?
Would you? Well, I don't know. Do you want to? Because when you were invested in that being a secret.
I don't want to. I don't want to, actually. I don't know why. I almost did.
Well, his initials are EC. That's in the show. So we'll leave it
That's
at
all
that.
you need to say. Let's call him EC. That it was important for me that was really the foundation of the whole thing, is what EC has been through, what he's read, what he's seen. I don't really want to go into what it was, the decisions that we all made, because I think it's important that an audience get to make those themselves, part of the fun of it. I remember the specifics of reading 7 when I knew how it was going to be revealed. It's incredibly liberating, because now you have this edge over an audience who have been learning about in one light, and suddenly anything goes, all bets are off, and you are completely unpredictable. They have no idea what to expect from you, and so you're suddenly that much more dangerous.
Cornelius Hickey, Corker's mate.
Your new home, Mr. Hickey. Once you've unpacked, check in with Mr. Darlington, the Corker. He's on the orlop.
The orlop, sir, is deck just below. Mm-hmm. Have you been on a ship before? Not like this one, sir. Change of pace, then. Change of everything, sir.
Adam, in our first podcast, Dan, Dave, and I talked about quite a bit about just the research that we fell in love with in doing the show. It's interesting because there's a lot written about the captains, right? Crozier has biographies. Fitzjames' letters have been published. We have, Franklin biographies. We know quite a lot about the leadership. We know a lot about the ships. But, we struggled with finding accurate voices of the seamen. The seamen were talked about as a mass, right? So the average biography of a seaman was this and this. But in terms of really drilling down to a seaman's inner psychology, it's the voices that were not recorded during those times. Was there anything else you turned to really delve into and yours is more complicated because you actually are not a seaman, as we will have learned, but just getting into the mindset of that Victorian psychology of the underclass?
Jean Genet was this sort of pose in criminality with a slight tendency for something wicked. But he was owning his transfiguring and outcast nature completely, and he was always looking for a method of escape. He was always trying to get away from it and express. And so Genet was someone I looked to a lot and saw a lot of similarities to my character in. It was such an exciting time, and I remember I think you both wrote me in an email at some point that if only he'd been born 40 years later, he would have had this abundance of opportunity to utilize his mind and his intelligence, and it wouldn't have been such a struggle to be acknowledged. Perhaps he would have written something depending on the books that he had access to.
It's interesting because I think you could say the same thing of Crozier, right? If he had been born 40, 50 years later, his career would have looked very differently in terms of meritocracy.
Up until episode 107, I feel like an audience is going to be with Hickey as a kind of anti-hero. And things take a rather dark turn in episodes 7 and 8. You really do a list of despicable things. As an actor, I'm wondering if when you get to a point in an arc where you know you are going to lose people's sympathy, if that changes your own sense of the character. Is it difficult to give up a certain status in an audience's mind for a different kind of status? What is that like from your point of view as an actor?
In complete honesty, it never occurred to me that any of those things were cruel or despicable, or that any audience would not completely understand. It never occurred to me that they were. Everything is justified, and obviously in my mind, he's completely correct in every single thing that he does, and he has to stay that way. To be honest, unfortunately, it's very difficult to let him go, and so I still defend him even now, even though the logic of my mind says no, that's actually naughty in the grand scheme of things. But the truth is, he convinced me, and he will always convince me, and I don't know why. But as an actor, I suppose you obviously have this complete oath and complete dedication that your character is. First of all, you don't really think about. I never thought about how he would be received, really, or how people's opinions of him, whether they liked him or not. That never ever entered my mind. But all that entered my mind was how much I loved him and how much I wanted to be him. And everything that he did, as soon as I read it in the scripts, masterfully put together, I just kept thinking, oh, what a good idea. Oh, well done. Oh, good move. I'd do that. That's clever. Yeah.
Well, in 107, we have the pivotal scene, which we also use as an audition scene, where you're talking with Hodgson. And it's pretty much, it's a scene where you lay out your philosophy, right? It's a scene where you lay out how you view man confronts emergencies. And it's where we discover that you've eaten Neptune. And by the way, you're going to lose some audience members for that, Adam. Now that you've lived with Hickey for months now, by the time we actually shot that scene in Croatia, how that scene changed for you? It's such a great scene.
I suppose it's slotted into place when you turn up and you realize the stakes, the circumstance, and the time constraints that you have. I don't mean in filming. I mean on the day, Hickey has a certain number of. This conversation has to happen quickly. It has to happen, in between certain things, and you don't necessarily get to embellish and explore character through that scene. You have to play the objective of it. I have to turn him, and when you read him with other actors in audition, you can play with different objectives because they're very, very generous to you, and they're not necessarily playing an objective, their own objective. They're reading with you, so it's sort of a way of highlighting the auditioning actor, which presumably is the point. But when you are, Christos as Hodgson is trying to get what he wants. He's trying to do what he wants to do, and so it made it very streamlined and very clear that we tried it number of ways. I remember we did it over and over and played around with it, and that was just what felt correct. That was going to get to him. That element of seriousness, the element of the time was running out, and we're relaxed here, but this is something that's important.
Lieutenant Hodgson is not a man. Although it did belong to one.
What have you done?
Just keep listening. I know this will make sense to you. Maybe only to you.
Hickey makes a lot of sense in that scene, and it may be on that plank that the audience will continue to follow you in a way, because you are being quite honest about what you're willing to do to survive, and you're giving people an option to join you in that. And I think that the way you played that scene for practicality is really kind of what makes that scene so riveting.
Survival is a nasty piece of business. But we do what we have to do. We reconfigure. We reinvent. We rearrange. Let me be your lieutenant in a new arrangement. Let us get out together.
Oh, Adam, I've always wanted to ask you this question about Irving's death in 107. Your body language as Irving is walking up to you and you shrug off that coat. Where did it's a beautiful, like, it almost felt like you look like a jaguar to me, or some kind of animal pouncing. And in the script, we talked about the coat coming off, but I remember like just really shocked by seeing that movement. How did you come up with that?
I remember it was, a lot of it was to do with a lot of, that animalistic, Crozier calls Hickey the first person to call Hickey a dog or a wolf is Irving. Just turn your wolf's ear to me now. And Crozier calls me a gammoning dog. And I just remember, so a lot of it was that sort of a wild, rabid, sort of street dog that when the cackles come up and they sort of straighten and they stiffen, it's quite an impacting moment. But I just remember you guys saying the importance, of getting Irving to sort of touch his skin if possible. And of course there's the practicality of not getting your clothes bloody, which was the whole point. I've got to strip down and make sure I don't get myself covered in blood because I can't explain it if I do. But yeah, I guess the physicality's a weapon that he uses, an element of surprise to say, not only am I not wearing any clothes, but trying to get Hickey to look, a lot of us lost a lot of weight, but I remember the idea of losing weight to try and get Hickey to look angular and grotesque and jagged, which began with Dan, your reference in the novel to his physicality, his knobbly. I remember the knobbly knees and the knobbly legs and I remember reading that and thinking that's inspiring. To see him, he should look part creature. His adaptability should be sort of physically visceral and palpable, and it should make you afraid of him. It should make you sort of withdraw. And then, I just wanted that wild, relentless sort of animal, I suppose, without any conscience, without any reserve or hesitation.
When that happens, to me, it suggested something profound, which is the crew, the ships, little England there, had moved into a different reality, which sounds science fiction-y, but I'm a science fiction writer at times, so that's the way I sound. You moved into the Inuit reality. The Tuunbaq can exist, but also I think Hickey can really feel his own character and kill whomever he wants. We're in a different reality now. We're not bound by little England there in the ship at tea at 2:00. So I think it all came together. The Tuunbaq attack was perfect. You're very much in a different reality. So then you have to deal with it. Of course, I like their answer about, what do we do if the thing comes back? Well, shoot him in the head and carve him up for supper.
Since the beginning of 7, since we know that Hickey is not Hickey, the idea of the discussion about him being a different reality, it's exactly what I felt, that it's a realm that you're waiting for, you're waiting to be exposed to. The whole episode, I always felt like, we know that you're not Hickey. Now, who are you? And as soon as that coat comes off him and he's been doing whatever he's been doing, and he turns around, that's the first time that we really see the the real foundations of him, the real blood and bone of who this person really is. And you're now in, and this new realm that we're in has allowed him to be unleashed. And it's sort of the first time this creature, this dangerous man, sort of literally stripped naked.
That scene also gave us a fantastic opportunity to introduce something into the sound design of the show that we were eager to do, which is to start having a very ambiguous relationship between the score and sound design, so that these environments started to feel like they had an energy to them that was not explainable just by the scenes, but by the almost the kind of psychic weight they had. That scene in particular was great, because as soon as Irving crests that hill, there's a very weird low rumble in the sound design that starts peaking. It starts, hitting the red in terms of the sort of the monitors we were using on the mix stage. And it sort of sounds like a wind. It sounds like a kind of vacuum. It's just a very upsetting noise, and it certainly doesn't sound like what you're meant to be hearing if your bearings in reality are fine. And when we decided to add back a kind of slow motion repeat of what the song Irving sings at Carnival, we thought, oh great, this should feel like we're opening a door to another reality in the show. So it's really gratifying to hear you say that.
Hickey! Hickey!
And then when we come back after the flashback to the very end of the episode, we strip everything away except for the echoes of the bells. And that wide shot where, Hickey, you're doing this really weird but beautiful hop.
Which is from the novel.
Yeah.
Hickey's described as doing a kind of dance.
To keep warm. And the camera's so far away from you, and yet... I think Dave and I fought for how long we would keep that shot going. I think we would have easily added 2 more minutes if we were allowed to on runtime.
Well, I think of that shot as sort of Hickey at some kind of bus stop in hell.
When I watch it now, and I think part of me thinks he's almost like a schizophrenic, that he's not when he's checking the bodies. Because someone could perceive it as that he's not sure what he's done, and he's waking up and he's going, okay, I'm cold, I'm here, I see two bodies, I've got a knife, I get it. But it also, but I remember the idea that he's literally that image of a person, just a completely practical to him, and he's just an innocent person, just waiting. He's just waiting at a bus stop trying to keep warm. There's nothing sinister, it's just, I'm just trying to keep warm, and that's it. That mixed with the soundscape and the reality of that whole situation made it just a really interesting moment that you guys created.
A question for Dan. We introduced a set piece into the season which is not in the book in episode 8. And I hope that it was as fun for you to watch that scene not knowing what was going to happen when the Tuunbaq attacks Terror Camp as it was for the millions of people who have read your book and all of your set pieces not knowing how those were going to turn out. What were you thinking when you were watching episode 8? And Cornelius Hickey is standing there with a noose around his neck, and in runs the Tuunbaq in something that is absolutely not from your novel.
Well, I was thinking, what the bleep? I loved it. I didn't have a trial of Hickey in my book, as I remember, and I certainly didn't have him ready to be hanged. So I was, very interested in what was going to happen next. And the Tuunbaq attack, I think, takes all that energy, a lot of it from Hickey, a lot of from the murder he committed, but it takes all that energy and moves it from a possible hanging to everybody together under attack.
There are many feats that preoccupy a captain's imagination, but abandoning his ship and his men should not be among them. Yet I hereby tender my
Oh, go on, Captain. You finish it.
Adam, for you, that moment, which in one sense could feel like a contrivance, and obviously we had a huge allergy to contrivances in the show and tried to steer away from them as much as we could. Having the Tuunbaq run into camp moments before you're to be hung, I remember conversations we had about it, that what could be considered a kind of a plot coincidence was actually quite useful to your arc. Can you talk about how?
Trying to figure out how I'm my best way out of it. And I've got a few plans up my sleeve, but again, it's the universe instructs the Tuunbaq to come and save me. It's very simple. Or and after it happens, it's to Hickey. It's of course you came to my rescue because we have bigger fish to fry. There are things that need to be done, and it's just one more sign I'm doing right. I'm in the right direction. I'm heading towards my ascension. To Hickey, he is the answer to everything, and what he's really looking for in his sort of innate, insatiable curiosity. What he's really looking for are bigger and bigger and bigger questions to which he can always apply himself. And this time, it's the Tuunbaq as this kindred spirits come to save him. Yeah, which sparks off that next level of relationship.
Tagging on fire! Captain! Mr. Hickey! Come back! Edward! The armory! That's where they'll go!
Speaking of the Tuunbaq attack, can we talk about the soul sucking? Because that's where we really introduce it in 108. Dave and I have gone back and forth of how much we need to highlight it. And it's very subtle in the show. And we're really pleased with where it landed for us. For you guys, how did you guys receive it?
I was interested in it. I think it was placed right. I think the subtlety worked to good effect, and the brief comments about it by people. It took a very difficult literary conceit, this idea of eating souls, and it turned into something not only visual but visceral.
Well, for us, what was interesting, the horror moment actually wasn't the moment when the Tuunbaq sucked the Colin's soul. It's after, and you see Tozer's face. That's the horror moment when you realize he's watching that moment and he's realizing this goes against everything I believe in this universe, and my brain and my body does not know how to compute with it. And David gave a great performance there. And that's when, for me, just because I'm not someone who's naturally loves the VFX and monster stuff, that's when I got the chills, was when we realized that shot needed to go at the very end of the episode and not before.
Right.
It just clicked.
Well, I think those shots, I think you earn them by the 1,000 grounded, reasonable, practical shots you have, leading up to it. Is that if you can ask, and I think Ridley has said this before, that you make something extraordinary work because you highlight all the ordinary parts of it, so that the few things that need to stand out in relief do so in a way that seems well modulated.
Well, we should wrap it up here now, you guys. I mean, it's been so much fun. On our next podcast, we'll finish with episodes 9 and 10. And Dave and I will be sad to say goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
I'm glad I didn't video record my reaction the first time I saw the different ending. Because speaking for 2 million readers, I stood up and shouted, "What's wrong with my ending?"
Welcome to the fourth and final installment of The Minds Behind AMC's The Terror, as we discuss our final 2 episodes of the show. I'm Dave Kajganich, creator and co-showrunner of the series, here with the Honorable Dan Simmons, creator of the novel The Terror, on which the series is based. Also with us is Hugh, executive producer and co-showrunner of the show, and Adam Nagaitis, who plays a man called Cornelius Hickey. Welcome back.
Hi.
Hi, Dave.
As we launch into our final episodes, now we are in an episode where the show begins to bend time. We cover a lot of ground in episode 9, a lot of distance. We say goodbye to quite a lot of characters, and we start to really bend the tone and the shape of the narrative towards this kind of horrible collision that's coming between Crozier and Hickey and our Tuunbaq.
So in 9, we say goodbye to so many of our characters. I mean, Dave and I cried the amount of tears that he and I shed editing the show, especially with 9 and 10. I mean, for you guys, Adam and Dan, which were the deaths that What did you think of the deaths?
What was your favorite death?
What's your favorite death?
My favorite was probably the one that really moved me was Fitzjames. I mean, it's such a fantastic story. His character's so interesting. That transition, just discovering, admitting who you are, and the firework at the Tuunbaq being his feat of courage, and then to end up to embrace death and to do it in such a beautiful way. And then the line of "There will be poems" that Mr. Bridgens says.
It's an honour serving you, sir. You're a good man. There will be poems.
It's a beautiful death. It's probably the best you could ask for in that situation. You're with a friend, and yeah, it's quite sad. Of course, you got to love Blanky's death as well. I mean, I'm cheating now, but yeah, Blanky's death is the greatest line to go out on, surely.
What in the name of God took you so fucking long?
We weren't entirely sure whether AMC was going to permit us to use that word, a curse word, because on AMC you're not meant to. Luckily for us, there are a number of AMC shows that have a precedent of using that word, and we argued successfely that could you ask for a better show, a better scene than a Victorian disaster show to use the F word, and they finally allowed us to use it, and we're really grateful.
I think just visually Bridgen's death was so beautiful, and that pull-out. And what was interesting is in our research we discovered that there was a corpse they discovered who had rolled over and was found sleeping on a set of papers. And in the show, Bridgens takes Pegler's diary, and when he chooses to die out there in the cold, alone, comforted with his memories, we see him roll over. And so that's just our nod to history. And it turns out we don't know whether or not it was actually Pegler's diary. It could have been Armitage's.
No, I think we know it's Pegler's journal, but we don't know whether the man lying on top of it was
Armitage
Bridgens.
or Bridgens. Then there's Good Sir's death. Oh my God, Good Sir. I can't believe Hickey, Adam. Good Sir.
Yeah, I know. He had it coming. I forgot that death, and that is I forgot all of those deaths. Actually, that is actually what a so beautifully acted. I mean, unbelievable. It was perfect. And then, the pure, clean images of the coral and the shell, and I loved it. And I think it's an orchid. I just loved it. I absolutely, and it's something. It's something that I don't like talking about that death. It's really horrible.
They were all very moving in their own way, saying goodbye to each of the characters. Surprisingly powerful. Some of them were not major characters, but everything connected for me watching your version. When Fitzjames is out with Crozier alone, and Fitzjames sort of acknowledges that he's a fake, that he's been just faking this heroism. The Admiralty sent a hero. They sent Fitzjames, who was the man of the moment, but he hadn't done that much. So he had the courage to say that, and Crozier immediately had the compassion to point out, no, you're here now and you're doing fine. That's not the dialogue, but that's the essence of his message. So all through these scenes with the different characters, I found compassion again. Was the way Crozier touched men who were close to the end, the tone of his voice. It wasn't mawkish. He wouldn't like me and get all sentimental, but it was so supportive. It was like Good Sir helping the poor boy at the beginning of the show, telling how death could be good, how you see light, you cross over, and the kid died in terror. Some of these people did. But most of them, they're like Fitzjames when he's, finally has to be carried in the sledge. And he has a sense of humor at the end. He can laugh at himself somewhat because he tells Crozier that bullet that went through his arm into his chest, that area is now so gangrene or rotten, the bullet is finally going to kill him. Ha ha.
Well, you pointed out a line from the first episode where Fitzjames is talking to Franklin, and he says, sometimes I think you love your men more than God loves them. And Franklin's response is, for all your sakes, let's hope you're wrong. And we brought that line back in a different way in episode 9, which is where the men are the survivors of the terror camp attack are about to leave. And they know Hickey's out there somewhere, and Fitzjames's impulse is to hide or destroy all of their extra supplies so that Hickey's group can't benefit from them. And Crozier has the opposite instinct, which is, because he knows some people in Hickey's group probably made that decision because they were afraid that the alternative was worse, to stay with Crozier and so many people, that he wants to offer them the resources in case they can use them and in case they want to make a different decision in the days ahead.
And the supplies we cannot carry. Hickey's band are waiting us out to loot the camp.
Some of the men with him made their choice out of fear, and not take away any chance they have to survive. We may meet them yet again. And if we do, I want them to make a different choice. Leave our supplies in a tidy pile as an offering. I want the men with Hickey to know that's how we meant it.
More than God loves them.
Lines like that are a real test. I mean, you struggle with them in the editing room. Did we earn that line? Is it important that an audience remember sort of that, as an index point, that line has now been sort of superficially applied to one man, but more sincerely applied to another man? And, that goes back to sort of a close reading of the book, Dan. I mean, just sort of scouring kind of through your dialogue, trying to figure out, how does a master, if I can say that, if I can refer to you that way, approach this idea of a relationship with an audience? And we learned an enormous amount from your book about restraint and indirection and credit, giving the audience credit. And I will say this, the series is different enough from your novel that I would encourage everyone who has seen the television show but not read your book to seek it out, because they will have just as rewarding, even more so possibly, a time of learning about this history through the lens of horror than they did watching the show. So I think they complement one another. I hope they do, and I hope people will seek out both.
That's kind of you, Dave. My wife keeps track of the tie-in version of the book, and it's selling very well. So some people are going to get. Yeah, some people are going to get that.
There is this fantastic scene that is in your book that we had neither money nor time to shoot, but it's where they discover leads and they take the boats out, going around, and they realize they're just going around in a circle. We didn't have the time to shoot that, and we rejiggered our narrative so that the leads ended up being a ploy on one of Hickey's secret mutineers. 9 is a very quiet episode, and in some ways in television shows, did you miss a set piece in 9? Did anyone miss having a bigger narrative punch?
Well, I'll answer and then let Adam answer. But for me, who had that boat scene and really liked it a lot, I didn't miss my stuff too much, because what happened was when the young man, a boy actually, who's secretly under Hickey's control, tells Crozier and the others that he sees open water, and they rush to the rocky beach to see it. And of course, that was a lie and a ploy to get them there so Hickey could seize them. But my heart just flew that open water. Oh boy, how would men have felt if they'd heard that? In reality, what was their reaction? Because the open water could conceivably be their savior. They could get other places, not just cross over and start marching through middle Canada, but they could go anywhere in open water. And to see it all locked in with ice was just stunning to me. It's such a disappointment. So, no, I don't miss my part of it very much.
I never thought of it as something that's such a quiet narrative like you described it, Sue. To me, it's... It sort of links 9. I see it 9 and 10 as one episode, really. It's this slow build and the creation of that relationship that the antithesis between these two camps and between the tactics employed and I just think the way you guys wrote it and put it together is flawless. I just think it's so beautifully weighted between the deaths that don't actually to me, they don't seem to just sort of monotonously pile up. They're all so beautifully handled and acted. And the whole time you have this tension building slowly that you know eventually it's gonna come to a head. I didn't feel when I watched it that it ever lacked punch. It had such clarity and such patience. Made it really beautiful.
And I don't know if we could say the C word on podcast, cannibalism.
Yes, that one we can.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Good. There was if Hickey hadn't already divided the troop into his people, the anointed, and then Crozier's group, it would have happened anyway because of the cannibalism. And when you think about it, think of that rugby team or soccer team or whatever that crashed the airplane, crashed in the Andes. They went back into society. They were cannibals. They admitted it. They got a book deal. And so presumably, even in England, these people would have been forgiven, or they would have kept it secret like some do. So cannibalism did in this show, I think, divide the people. I didn't see, until he was forced to imbibe in cannibalism, I didn't see Crozier even considering it. And so that fascinates me, just how far people will go to survive.
I'll give you some advice. Don't indulge your morals over your practicals. Not now. Don't you also want to live?
Dave, we talked a lot about this, is when you're in that moment, you're not Dave Kajganich, and I'm not Sue Hugh in that moment, choosing whether or not we decide to eat someone. Something else will take over, whether it is the Gutser in us or whether it is the Hickey in us in that moment. I think that's why when we shot that scene, after Gibson is cut up, Adam, remember when we shot reaction shots from each one of you eating your first bite of human flesh meat? And we took so much, we shot so much. We shot, closes, mediums, just because Dave and I, at that point, we were very confident of how to shoot everything. That was probably the moment where we were like, Well,
we wanted to know how little we could get away with. And what we found was, of course, as typical for the show, the performances were so terrific that we didn't need very much. And I remember on the mix stage, the first mix that they did of the show, of that episode, there was quite a lot of chewing. And so when I said, no, let's pull all of that out and use the most minute changes in expression, because all of you at that table were so well in character that even the slightest muscle movement on your face communicated everything we needed you to. And we were obviously very interested in not overplaying that scene, knowing that audiences have been waiting for it, wondering in what kind of taste we would show it, how we would modulate it. And, a rule throughout the show was to try to present everything with its most practical face, including this. And so, hopefully when that lands for people, it will be both satisfying in the sense that they will understand how these characters made that decision, but it won't feel that we have over-articulated it somehow.
I'm not religious, but I'm obsessed with religion. And in your story and the way you structured it, you have, in a sense, we've already talked, or at least I have, how Hickey seems to be evolving toward Messiahdom. I think near the end, he thinks he is the Messiah, but it's Gutser who provides the Last Supper. How much more powerful story of Christ is there than, take, eat, and it's yourself. And it's fascinating to me that the man who dedicated his life to helping people and curing people and being empathic at their ending, his last act is to kill as many of Hickey's people as possible. And, so there's that's where the trial was. It wasn't when Hickey was going to be hanged. It was inside Dr. Gutser when he decides these people need to end, and I will do it.
Well, should we talk about the big scene at it's not the end, the Tuunbaq sequence in 110?
To set it up, Adam, you're Hickey, we'll keep calling him Hickey even though we've established he isn't. You get an important piece of information in episode 9 where Sergeant Tozier relays to you a piece of information he hasn't shared with anyone, that he watched Collins be killed and he watched Collins' soul be pulled out of his body. And, for Hickey, suddenly a lot of things make sense. What happened to Private Heather, who was alive for many episodes but no longer sort of present in his body? I mean, you even have a scene where you poke his brain, hoping to get some kind of reaction out of him. And you take that piece of information and you suddenly realize you're no longer in a kind of survival story. You're in a spiritual story. You're in a kind of mythological story suddenly. Can you talk about how you decided to play that so it was sort of clear to an audience that what that opportunity was, because we did not devote a lot of dialogue to it. It was going to have to be something an audience felt as much as was described to them.
I can only describe the way that the process in the mind of it, with that you're seeing Hickey has a plan up until that point. He started the way that I thought about it was that once he starts to hear things, he starts to have this space of this area, this creates this space in his mind, and he understands the things that have come before him, and his curiosity leads him to, one element of him is still practically engaged in survival and outmaneuvering the captain and heading south and coming up with a plan and a story as to what happened. But then there are other elements of, consuming human flesh that might be an answer there. It might be an enlightening experience. And if it's not in that, is it in something else? And he finds the hill, and he understands when he sees that hill that he hears something, and then he's not quite clear on what it is, what's drawing him, and what's talking to him, and what he's feeling. But he's becoming one with this realm, and he starts to once he discovers the supernatural element. Not that he hasn't already established that there is one, but the fact that it's such a specific, he's been developing his knowledge of the summoning song that Lady Silence sings to become a shaman, the rules of this particular realm, this empire. And he's been gathering this information as we go along, all the way through the series. He's been taking pieces of information and he pockets it and learns and keeps it for later.
Tuunbaq. A spirit that dresses as an animal. Yet we shot it with a cannon and drew blood. How do you reconcile that?
I can't. There's much about this voyage I can't reconcile.
What mythology is this creature at the center of?
About the creature, I have no answers, Mr. Hickey. We were not meant to know of it.
And when he gets this key piece of the puzzle that the Tuunbaq is taking souls, and that linked with perhaps there's a hierarchy, there's a hierarchy of what the Tuunbaq wants to eat, a captain and important people. He realizes that he really is the center of this universe. I suppose the way that I adjusted it was that everybody else became irrelevant, completely irrelevant. I no longer needed to worry about manipulation, control, fear. Everything was going to sing for me. So everything was going to work as if I had magic hands and my voice just dictated what the universe would do.
I didn't have anywhere near an equal on this expedition. But you. I wanted to thank you for that. On the eve of what is quite an important day.
Every single conversation was an annoyance because it was getting in the way of me listening to the universe, this world, this empire, this realm that was now speaking to me. And I was talking to the Tuunbaq, from this distance, and we had this dance going. And everything that happened was just getting in my way, and it was all going to work itself out because I've been chosen to ascend, to reach this ascension, to, ride the Tuunbaq into my new empire and to take my new throne. And I was finally going to be given the answers to these questions that I'd been asking.
Book of Nelson, Book of Jesus, Book of Joseph and Mary, Book of the Archbishop of Canterbury. None ever wanted nothing from me.
When you offer the Tuunbaq the tongue,
and there's that pause, what's going to happen? And he bites your arm off instead, and that look on your face of just, you too have failed me.
At two,
right? At
two, Tuunbaq.
Exactly, two Tuunbaq. That's a great T-shirt. But that scene, I drifted, but that scene in particular, there's a slight difference to what his plan was, which was to climb the hill, sacrifice the men, sacrifice the tongue, and become one with the Tuunbaq, and to take my place on the throne in this new realm. And to find the answers and maybe, climb through to a different realm, or who knows what. This empire was now my empire, which was the culmination of all of his all of Hickey through his entire life has been leading to this point, and he's quietened himself enough to hear it. And then suddenly he gets sick because somebody poisons him. And so it's a slightly different feeling as he's climbing the hill, and it's a different, something else is happening inside him. But he's still perfectly capable of executing his plan. He gets carried away in that scene, and then by the time the Tuunbaq appears, he kind of focuses again and becomes very excited. And it's a relationship with the Tuunbaq. It's a dance that everything is for him and the Tuunbaq. Everyone else is irrelevant.
But what he gets so wrong about the Tuunbaq, and I think what a lot of the Western characters in our show gets wrong about the Tuunbaq, is the Tuunbaq is not a deity. The Tuunbaq doesn't ask to be a god, right? It's all it is this arbiter of what is good or what is not good for the land. But there's no sense of the Tuunbaq wanting to be the ultimate creative force here, and I think that's where Hickey was wrong, right?
I think he sees it as a supernatural creature, and again, because everything comes through him and the universe revolves around him, that it's a challenge for him. It's a question for him, and it feels a lot in questions as opposed to answers, and what his position is in the universe, I think. And by the time he meets this creature that eats souls, and the creature's sick, and it's sick because he hasn't united with it yet. It's because of me that it's sick. It's because I haven't been in contact with it, and we haven't united ourselves and taken over this empire. It doesn't see it for what it is.
When you guys see the Tuunbaq's death in the very end of that sequence, how did you guys feel?
Speaking for the novelist here, I was surprised. And then I got through the surprise and felt, yeah. And then I immediately wondered how Lady Silence would have to pay for this death, because you'd already shown me that she's in charge of protecting the Tuunbaq as well as controlling it in some way, and she wasn't really up to the task. So I like then going when Crozier's with the intimate band, learning that she's been punished and set out by herself. But the Tuunbaq's death itself just seemed right at that time.
It was a horrible thing to watch as a viewer. It was so sad, and it spoke to me of this sort of contemporary. It was sort of a global warming issue. Not to bring it round, but it was sort of like that's it. They've killed it. They killed the Tuunbaq, and we're actually rejoicing for Crozier's survival. But really, the man deserves death. And the creature and that creates balance to this culture should be alive, and we have this upside down world that we are celebrating, and it's which is so intelligent of you guys to create, and it's difficult to take, but that creature's gone, and so balance is gone, and we here we are.
The very specific and subtle things that we put in the show is that probably no one will decode it until they hear this podcast, but was important to us as a structural element was Sir John dies when he's killed down the fire hole in episode 3. He has some flashes, subjective kinds of hallucinations, I suppose, or visions. I don't know what you would call them, but one of them is of open water. It's just a vista of the future of the Arctic, that there are going to be these, that there's going to be a huge melt, and there's going to be all of this open water, and And for the final shot, we tried to match as much as we could the angle so that all of that frozen water that Crozier is sitting on at that seal hole would maybe possibly evoke that memory. To speak to what you're saying, Adam, which is that this whole thing is a kind of, it's from the Netflix point of view, it's a huge tragedy in which these Europeans are the terrors in a way, and not to be too reductive about it. But we wanted the season to have that kind of change of polarity, which is one reason why we couldn't quite use the sort of the ending of the book as much as we loved it, Dan, was because it felt like a lot of things that would feel that would pull the point of view of the season across that line too much and too late. We wanted to try to modulate it a little bit so that every episode felt like you were giving some room in your point of view for Lady Silence's perspective or the Inuit's perspective, and that change would happen so slowly you might not even notice that it was happening at all, which is one reason why we made that decision. You gave every character I saw room to have his or her own apotheosis, which is a big theme with you guys. I mean, the arcs end in people becoming someone else. Crozier grows into his leadership, I think, beautifully. Maybe he deserved punishment, but I found Crozier and his empathy. Like when Fitzjames is dying in the boat, it's Crozier that touches him and lets him know that, through physical contact, that he's not alone. And giving them room is unusual. I just find there's so many unusual elements to what you three have created that I have to warn you, I think it deserves a lot of intelligent attention. Well, I hope we can volley a lot of those right back to the book, Dan. Well, we should take some time at the end to given that after this sequence, this really becomes almost a kind of silent film to deliver the ending to Crozier's arc, to really sing the praises of Jared Harris in this show. I mean, what he did with this role is remarkable. So, Dan, I would love to know what you thought of Jared Harris's Francis Crozier. After watching the 10 episodes and him and all those and watching what he did with it, I just wanted him to adopt me. Carry me off. He would love that. But it's certainly, leading is the operative word, isn't it? He just, he didn't give 100 or 1,000%. He gave more of that to the character. He became Crozier for me. I'm the one that had to dream up the man and see what he looked like and write about him for about 1,100 pages, 700 and finally in type. And so I had my Crozier. He was pretty solid. But now Jared Harris is Crozier. There's no doubt in my mind. The ending of the season is quite different from the ending of the book, Dan. How did you feel watching the ending of the show? And in all candor, do you feel that it was satisfying? Do you feel that it was at least a good companion piece for the ending of the book? Well, I'm glad I didn't video record my reaction the first time I saw the different ending, because speaking for 2 million readers, I stood up and shouted, "What's wrong with my ending? Is it chopped liver?" And I realized it would be. I realized that I don't think you could have taken my ending and made it a sensible finale visually and the way it went. So I tracked the whole episodes. The last 2 episodes were enlightenment to me, because I'm just a viewer now. I'm watching something I didn't create. These are not my ideas. So I sat back and enjoyed it, as horrible as they were. So when I watched your ending, the only thing I was bothered about it was I'm sentimental. And the real Crozier, I believe, and certainly the fictional Crozier that we've all created, was so lonely. He was so alone in life. I think Hickey was less alone than Crozier was. And, rejected by Franklin's niece several times for marriage, a life where he really felt rejection, probably more than Hickey did. And at the end, I wanted him to be with someone. So as much as I liked your ending, and I really thought it was proper and appropriate for the series, I would have put a person next to him as he's fishing out there, in his Inuit outfit at night, waiting by a seal. He's not fishing. He's waiting by a seal breathing hole to kill it. So if I'd seen a glimpse of 2 of them, I wouldn't even need to see their faces.
the sentimental side of me would have been happy.
But we leave that ambiguous in the ending in terms of he is not with Lady Silence. She, had to pay the bill in some ways for the loss of the Tuunbaq, and her destiny is to venture forth alone. And in some ways, her storyline is the most tragic of all the characters in our show because, the price she paid is so harsh. But in terms of the last shot, which Dave and I just we knew pretty early on that was going to be our last shot, and it felt right. We don't know much about Crozier's biography. For all we know, that child could be his, it may not. We actually didn't want to fill in too much of the coloring book at that point. It's up to the audience to describe whether or not that last shot is... It's interesting because we had this big argument, lovely argument, in the color suite, the grading suite, of how we grade that last shot. Whether we grade it bright and sunny to be optimistic, or we grade it with a lot of contrast and stamp down a lot of light to make it seem that his, there's a harshness to his reality. And in some ways we split the middle, and that way the audience can decide whether or not the life Crozier has at the end is it one of punishment, reckoning, or whether or not he will move on and have something different.
And I think something in that final shot that certainly we couldn't have planned, that tipped things in a warmer direction, was the child that plays that boy in the shot, who's meant to be sleeping against Crozier as he's waiting at the seal hole, really fell asleep. And because he was wrapped up in fur, and Jared's a very welcoming person, and he fell asleep, and in the middle of that shot he twitches in his sleep like children do. And I think if you catch that, it's quite it's undeniably a warm moment. You don't know whether that's Crozier's son, whether that's just a friend's son, it's someone he's taking care of. But you do get a sense that there is a community, and it's a warm one, even though that life will be difficult. And he will occupy no position of leadership in that world. He will be, he's missing a hand at that point. It's going to be a rough road ahead of him. But we decided to sort of be as ambiguous as we could, but for that child who twitches in his sleep, which we just loved that that's a part of that final shot of the show.
Now you've made me want to go back and watch that scene about 10 times. I think you did at the ending essentially what you chose to do throughout the series, which is to trust in the...
For a long time. Dan, you've probably been... How long has it been for you?
Oh, since about 1994.
Wow. Yeah, wow. What is it about this story that it's hard to let go? Even now, there's a grieving process that I feel like I have.
I know why it's hard to let go. You created real people. You did something that is incredibly rare, I think, for any medium, movies, series, anything. They're real people, and when they suffer, the viewer suffers with them. When they try to fight back and survive, that's the viewer's impression, and we're sorry to see each one of them go, including Hickey. So I think there's a success in what you set out to do.
Well, we're just so thrilled, Dan, that you gave us the trust to do your book, but also that you love it. We were so nervous that you would hate this adaptation.
Well, and now what's amazing is we all get to sort of take a seat in the theater of real history playing out again, now that they've discovered the ships. We've been told by Parks Canada and by people we've met who are actively on this, on the archaeological expeditions now, dives to the ships, that there is a chance that they will find a ship's log, and that all of the questions that have come up and perplexed us and preoccupied us and fascinated us in the researching of both the writing of the novel and the creating of the television show, that those questions may have answers soon. And so we are now all back in the position of being riveted by this actual history. And what a treat it will be to have a conversation in a year when we have learned hopefully much more about what actually happened on this expedition.
If I were on the expedition ship and found the log, the diaries, everything, I would hide them.
Agreed.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've all done a lot of work here. Who cares about reality?
Well, thank you, Adam. Thank you, Dan, for joining us. Sue and I have had a fantastic time having this extended conversation that hopefully is interesting to people who have watched and appreciated the show. So thank you for the opportunity to do it. It's